They say that love is patient, love is kind. But what they don't tell you is that sometimes, love gets taken for granted so completely that kindness becomes weakness, and patience becomes an invitation for exploitation. My name is Margaret, I'm 68 years old, and for 37 years I thought I knew what unconditional love meant. I thought I understood what it meant to sacrifice for family, to give without expecting anything in return. I was wrong. What I learned was that some people will take everything you offer and still demand more, and when you finally say no, they'll try to destroy you for it. It started 3 years ago when my husband Robert passed away. Robert had been everything to me, my partner, my best friend, my anchor in this world. We'd built a beautiful life together, raised our son Daniel, supported him through college, helped him start his career, celebrated every milestone. Robert was the kind of man who taught by example. He showed Daniel what it meant to work hard, to treat people with respect, to take care of family. When Robert died suddenly of a heart attack, I felt like half of my soul had been torn away. Daniel seemed devastated too at first. He came to the funeral, held my hand during the service, told me he'd always be there for me. I remember feeling grateful that at least I still had my son, that Robert had raised a good man who would help me navigate this new reality. I was 55 then, not ancient by any means, but suddenly alone in a way I'd never experienced. The house felt enormous and empty. Every routine Robert and I had shared became a painful reminder of his absence. Getting dressed in the morning felt like climbing a mountain. Making coffee for one person seemed pointless. But Daniel stepped up, or so I thought. He started coming by every weekend, helping with household repairs that Robert used to handle, taking care of paperwork and financial matters that overwhelmed me in my grief. He'd bring groceries, check on the house security, make sure I was eating properly. For the first few months, I felt blessed to have such a caring son. When people at church asked how I was managing, I'd tell them proudly that Daniel was wonderful, that he was taking such good care of me. What I didn't realize at first was that his help came with expectations. It started small. He'd mention casually that his rent was due and things were tight at work. I'd write him a check without thinking twice about it. When his car needed repairs, he'd bring me the estimate and I'd cover it. When he wanted to take his girlfriend Jessica out somewhere special, he'd hint about how expensive restaurants were these days until I offered to pay. Each time he'd thank me graciously, tell me he was so grateful to have such a generous mother, promise he'd pay me back when his financial situation improved. The paybacks never came, but I didn't mind. Robert had left me well provided for. We'd saved carefully throughout our marriage, invested wisely, paid off the house years ago. I had Robert's life insurance, his pension, social security, and our various investment accounts. Money wasn't an issue for me. What mattered was feeling useful, feeling like I still had purpose in caring for my child even though he was 32 years old. But as the months passed, Daniel's requests became more frequent and more substantial. He started dating Jessica seriously, and she began accompanying him on his visits to my house. Jessica was 28, worked in marketing, and had very specific ideas about how life should be lived. She was polite enough to me in person, always calling me Mrs. Henderson in a voice that managed to sound both respectful and slightly condescending. She had a way of looking around my house that made me feel like she was calculating the value of everything in it. It was Jessica who first planted the idea in Daniel's mind that I was living in a house that was too big for me. During Sunday dinners that I cooked and hosted every week, she'd make comments about how much work it must be to maintain such a large property. She'd suggest that maybe I'd be happier in a smaller place, somewhere with less upkeep, fewer stairs, more people my age around. She made it sound like she was concerned for my well-being, but I could hear something else underneath her words. She was already envisioning what could be done with my resources once they weren't tied up in maintaining my independence. Daniel began echoing her concerns. He'd point out that I was getting older, that the house had stairs, that the yard required maintenance. He'd bring up news stories about elderly people who'd fallen and been unable to get help, about break-ins in suburban neighborhoods, about the benefits of senior living communities. Every conversation seemed designed to make me feel vulnerable and impractical for wanting to stay in the home I'd shared with Robert for 25 years. But I wasn't vulnerable, and I wasn't impractical. I was 65 years old, in good health, with a sharp mind and more financial security than most people half my age. I'd raised a child, managed a household, worked part-time jobs throughout my marriage, and handled complex financial decisions alongside Robert. I knew exactly what they were doing, even if I didn't want to admit it to myself. They were setting the stage to convince me that I needed to be taken care of, that I needed them to make decisions for me. The wedding announcement came on a Thursday evening in September. Daniel and Jessica arrived for dinner with a bottle of champagne and enormous smiles. They'd got engaged, they told me, and they were planning a spring wedding. I was genuinely happy for them at first. Despite my growing reservations about Jessica, I wanted Daniel to be happy, and he certainly seemed to be. I hugged them both, opened the champagne, and listened as they described their vision for the ceremony. That's when the dollar signs started flying. Jessica had been planning this wedding in her mind for months, apparently. She wanted a destination wedding in Napa Valley, with welcome parties and rehearsal dinners and post-wedding brunches. She wanted designer dresses and professional photographers and live bands. She wanted flowers flown in from specific regions and catering from award-winning chefs. As she described each element, Daniel would nod enthusiastically and add details about venues and guest lists and transportation arrangements. I sat there doing math in my head as they talked, and the numbers were staggering. Conservative estimates put their dream wedding at $60,000 or $70,000. More likely, given Jessica's taste for luxury and Daniel's eagerness to indulge her every whim, they were looking at $80,000 or more. When I gently asked how they planned to pay for all this, they exchanged a look that I now recognize as the look of people who'd already made assumptions about someone else's money. Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. He said that they'd talked about it extensively, and they knew it was a lot to ask, but they were hoping I might be willing to help with the wedding expenses. Not all of it, of course, just whatever I felt comfortable contributing. Family was so important, and they wanted to start their marriage with a celebration that honored everyone who'd supported them. Robert would have wanted to see Daniel happily married, wouldn't he? And since Robert wasn't here to walk his son down the aisle or give a father's toast, maybe I could honor his memory by making sure Daniel had the wedding of his dreams. It was emotional manipulation at its finest, wrapping their request in grief and obligation and family loyalty. But what bothered me most wasn't the manipulation itself. It was how natural it seemed to them, how easily they assumed that my money was their money, that my financial security existed primarily to fund their lifestyle choices. They'd already planned an extravagant wedding based on my resources without ever actually asking if I was willing to provide those resources. I told them I needed time to think about it. I said that planning a wedding was a big decision and I wanted to make sure we approached it thoughtfully. This wasn't the answer they wanted to hear. Jessica's smile became strained, and Daniel's expression shifted to something I'd never seen from him before. It was impatience mixed with entitlement mixed with irritation. He said he'd thought I'd be excited for them, that he'd expected his mother to want to help with the most important day of his life. Why did I need time to think about whether I loved him enough to support his happiness? Over the following weeks, the pressure intensified. They'd bring me wedding magazines and show me pictures of ceremonies that cost more than most people's cars. They'd describe how disappointed their friends would be if they had to settle for something simple, how this was their one chance to have a perfect beginning to their marriage. Daniel started calling me every day, sometimes multiple times, asking if I'd made my decision yet. Jessica began making comments about how some mothers would do anything for their children's happiness, how lucky her friends were to have such supportive families. The emotional blackmail was relentless. Daniel would reminisce about all the sacrifices Robert and I had made for him growing up, all the ways we'd always put his needs first. He'd talk about how hard Robert had worked to provide for the family, how he'd want his legacy to be one of generosity and love. He'd describe how empty and meaningless a small wedding would feel, how he'd always dreamed of celebrating with everyone he cared about in a beautiful setting. But what truly disturbed me was the way they began involving other people in their campaign. Jessica started calling my sister Mary, explaining how excited they were about their wedding plans and how grateful they were that I was going to make it possible. She called my neighbor Patricia, who'd become a close friend since Robert's death, to ask for advice about planning such a significant celebration. She even contacted my pastor, Father Williams, to discuss ceremony options and mention how blessed they felt to have family support for their special day. These weren't innocent conversations. They were strategic moves designed to create social pressure, to make it seem like my financial contribution was already a settled matter. By the time these people talked to me, they'd already been led to believe that I was happily funding Daniel's wedding. Backing out would make me look like I'd gone back on my word, like I was the kind of person who promised things and then changed her mind. The manipulation reached its peak in November. Daniel and Jessica invited me to dinner at an expensive restaurant to discuss wedding details. They'd made appointments with venues and caterers and photographers, they said, and they wanted me to be involved in the decision-making process. It was sweet, they said, for the three of us to plan this together as a family. They'd made a reservation at Chez Laurent, one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, the kind of place Robert and I might have gone once a year for our anniversary. During dinner, they presented me with a folder of wedding planning documents, contracts with vendors, price quotes, timelines, guest lists. Everything was organized and professional and detailed. The total cost, spelled out clearly across multiple pages, was $82,400. They'd already put deposits down on several vendors, they explained, to secure the best dates and services. Some of these deposits were non-refundable, which meant that canceling would result in significant financial losses. I sat there looking at those numbers. At the casual way, they'd committed nearly $100,000 of what they clearly believed was my money, and I felt something I'd never experienced before in my relationship with my son. I felt used, not just asked for help, not just leaned on in a time of need, but actually used as a resource to be exploited. They'd manipulated me emotionally, socially, and financially to get to this point where saying no would be difficult and expensive. But what happened next showed me exactly who Daniel had become, and it changed everything between us forever. When I told them, as calmly as I could, that $82,000 was more than I was comfortable spending on a wedding, Daniel's reaction was immediate and vicious. His face flushed red, his voice rose loud enough that other diners turned to look at us, and the words that came out of his mouth were like knives cutting through everything I thought I knew about my son. He said I was being selfish and cruel. He said Robert would be ashamed of me for putting money ahead of family. He said I was living in a house worth $500,000 while my only child was asking for help with the most important day of his life, and what kind of mother does that? He said I'd been promising them support for months, getting their hopes up, letting them make plans, and now I was pulling the rug out from under them like some kind of vindictive old woman who'd forgotten what love was supposed to look like. Jessica tried to calm him down, but he was just getting started. He said I'd become bitter and stingy since Robert died, that I'd turned into one of those elderly people who hoards money instead of using it for anything meaningful. He said I was being pathetic, clinging to resources I'd never even earned myself while watching my son struggle. Robert had worked his whole life to take care of his family, Daniel said, and I was spitting on that legacy by refusing to take care of the next generation. The word pathetic hung in the air like a physical presence. I could feel other diners staring, could see servers pretending not to notice the drama unfolding at table 12. My own son, the boy I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through sleepless nights, cheered at soccer games, helped with homework, sent to college, supported through career changes and relationship troubles, had just called me pathetic in public because I wouldn't hand over $82,000 for a party. I didn't say anything in response. I couldn't. I was too shocked, too hurt, too overwhelmed by the realization that this was who Daniel really was now. I sat there absorbing his anger while Jessica made apologetic faces at the people around us and whispered that everyone was just stressed about wedding planning. When Daniel finally ran out of steam, I quietly asked for the check, paid for our very expensive dinner, and drove home in complete silence. That night I sat in Robert's study, surrounded by the financial documents and investment statements he'd taught me to manage, and I made some phone calls. I called our family attorney, James Morrison, who'd been Robert's friend since college and had handled all our legal matters for decades. I called our financial advisor, Sarah Chen, who'd been managing our portfolio since Robert's retirement. I called Patricia next door and asked if she could recommend a good locksmith. And then I called my sister Mary and told her exactly what had happened at dinner and exactly what I planned to do about it. Because here's what Daniel didn't know about his pathetic mother. He didn't know that the house he thought was worth $500,000 was actually worth closer to $800,000, thanks to improvements Robert and I had made over the years and the way property values had increased in our neighborhood. He didn't know that Robert's life insurance had been far more substantial than we'd ever mentioned, or that Robert's pension and investment portfolio had continued growing even after his death. He didn't know that I'd been quietly managing a financial situation that would have surprised him greatly. Robert and I had lived well within our means throughout our marriage, investing carefully and consistently, buying rental properties in emerging neighborhoods, putting money into accounts that Daniel had never even heard of. We'd planned for retirement, for long-term care, for leaving a legacy. We'd been generous with Daniel throughout his life, but we'd never revealed the full extent of what we'd built together. Most importantly, Daniel didn't know that everything I owned could be transferred, restructured, or redirected with a few legal documents and some strategic phone calls. The house was in my name only now that Robert was gone. The investment accounts were mine to manage. The rental properties, the retirement funds, the life insurance proceeds, all of it was under my control. I'd been careful to maintain my financial independence even while being generous with my son, and now I was grateful for that caution. Saturday morning, Daniel called to apologize. Sort of. He said he'd been stressed about wedding planning and had reacted poorly to my concerns about the cost. He said he understood that $82,000 was a lot of money, and maybe they could find ways to reduce some expenses. Maybe they could have a smaller guest list, or choose less expensive flowers, or find a more affordable venue. He was willing to compromise, he said, as long as I was still planning to help with the wedding. His apology was really another negotiation tactic. He wasn't sorry for calling me pathetic, or for humiliating me in public, or for taking my generosity for granted. He was sorry that his strategy hadn't worked, and now he was trying a different approach. The entitlement was still there, just wrapped in more reasonable language. He still assumed my money was available to fund his lifestyle choices, he was just willing to haggle over the price. I told him I was still thinking about everything, that I needed more time to make such a significant financial decision. This time, his impatience was barely controlled. He said they'd already put deposits down, that vendors were expecting payments, that time was running out for booking the services they wanted. Every day I delayed was costing them opportunities, he said. How much time did I need to decide whether I loved my son enough to help him start his marriage properly? The pressure campaign resumed immediately, but now it had a desperate edge. Jessica called me twice that day, once to apologize for Daniel's outburst and once to share how sad she was that their dream wedding might not happen. Mary called to tell me that Jessica had phoned her crying, worried that the family was falling apart over money. Patricia mentioned that Jessica had stopped by to ask if I seemed upset about anything lately, but the most manipulative move came Sunday evening. Daniel and Jessica showed up at my house unannounced, bringing a carefully prepared presentation. They'd created a detailed budget breakdown, showing exactly where every dollar would go. They'd found some cost savings, bringing the total down to $78,000. They'd prepared payment schedules, showing how I could spread the expense over several months if that would make it easier. They'd even brought testimonials from Jessica's married friends about how wonderful their own weddings had been and how important it was to start a marriage with a celebration that reflected the love and support of family. The presentation was professional and thorough and completely insulting. They'd spent time and effort creating materials designed to convince me to spend my money on their party, as if the issue was that I didn't understand what I'd be buying. They talked about return on investment in terms of family happiness, about the importance of creating memories that would last a lifetime, about how this wedding would strengthen family bonds and create a foundation for their future children to be proud of. Daniel ended the presentation with an emotional speech about how much my support meant to them, how they couldn't imagine getting married without knowing their family was behind them, how they'd always remember my generosity every time they looked at their wedding photos. It was a performance worthy of a professional fundraiser, complete with visual aids and emotional manipulation and carefully crafted talking points. When they finished, I thanked them for their hard work and told them I'd give them my final answer soon. The look that passed between them when I said final answer was revealing. It was frustration mixed with disbelief mixed with calculation. They'd expected this presentation to close the deal, to overcome whatever objections I might have had. The fact that I was still hesitating was clearly incomprehensible to them. Monday morning, I met with James Morrison in his law office downtown. James had been Robert's best man at our wedding, had handled the purchase of our house, had helped us set up our wills and estate planning. He knew our family history, understood our values, and had always given us sound advice about protecting what we'd built together. When I described what had been happening with Daniel and the wedding demands, his reaction was immediate and clear. "Margaret," he said, "you're being financially abused by your own son. This isn't a loving child asking for help with a special occasion. This is an adult who's decided that your resources exist for his benefit, and he's using every manipulation tactic in the book to get what he wants. If he was anyone else, you'd recognize this behavior immediately and shut it down. The fact that he's your son doesn't make it acceptable." James helped me understand something I'd been trying not to acknowledge. Daniel's behavior had escalated from normal requests for help to systematic financial exploitation. The wedding demand wasn't an isolated incident, it was the culmination of years of conditioning me to believe that saying no to him meant I didn't love him. He'd trained me to feel guilty about my own financial security, to second-guess my right to make decisions about my own money. We spent 3 hours that morning restructuring my financial affairs in ways that would protect me from further manipulation. James explained how to set up clear boundaries around my assets, how to create legal barriers that would prevent anyone from pressuring me into decisions I wasn't comfortable with. We updated my will to reflect my new understanding of Daniel's character, changed beneficiaries on several accounts, and set up a trust structure that would ensure my resources were used according to my wishes, not someone else's demands. But the most important conversation we had was about the difference between helping someone you love and enabling someone who's taking advantage of you. James helped me understand that giving Daniel the money for this wedding wouldn't just be expensive, it would be destructive. It would confirm for him that manipulation and emotional blackmail were effective tools for getting what he wanted. It would teach him that my boundaries were negotiable and my financial security was available for his convenience. Tuesday evening, Daniel called again. This time, his tone was different. There was an edge of panic in his voice that I hadn't heard before. Some of the wedding vendors were asking for additional payments, he said. The venue wanted to finalize details, the caterer needed headcounts, the photographer was booking other events. Time was running out for keeping their current arrangements in place. If I was going to help them, he needed to know soon so they could move forward with confidence. I could hear Jessica in the background, coaching him on what to say. Her voice was urgent and insistent, and I caught fragments of her whispered instructions. Tell her about the deadlines, remind her about the deposits they'd already paid, explain how disappointed everyone would be if the wedding had to be cancelled. She was orchestrating his emotional manipulation in real time, and neither of them seemed to realize I could hear her. When Daniel finished his prepared remarks, I told him I'd made my decision. I said I wouldn't be contributing to their wedding expenses, that I thought they needed to plan a celebration they could afford on their own, and that I hoped they'd understand my position. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear Jessica's sharp intake of breath, could picture Daniel's face processing what I just said. His response was immediate and brutal. He said I was destroying his future, ruining the most important day of his life, proving that I'd never really loved him the way a mother should love her child. He said I was selfish and heartless and that Robert would be disgusted by what I'd become. He said I was choosing money over family, greed over love, and that he'd never forgive me for this betrayal. But then he said something that revealed the depth of his manipulation and the coldness of his calculations. He said, "Fine, if that's how you want to play it, we'll remember this when you're old and sick and need us to take care of you. Don't come crying to us when you're alone and pathetic and wishing you'd treated your family better when you had the chance." It was a threat disguised as a consequence. He was telling me that my financial support was the price of his continued relationship with me, that refusing to fund his wedding would cost me his presence in my future. He was weaponizing my own mortality, suggesting that I'd regret my decision when I was vulnerable and dependent. The cruelty of it took my breath away. Jessica took the phone from him at that point, and her approach was different but equally manipulative. She spoke softly, sadly, like a disappointed daughter trying to reach a mother who'd lost her way. She said she'd always looked forward to having me as a mother-in-law, always hoped we'd have the kind of close relationship where families supported each other through life's important moments. She said she'd been bragging to her friends about how generous and loving Daniel's mother was, and now she didn't know what to tell them. She said she understood that money was important to me, but surely family should be more important than money. Surely the happiness of my only child should matter more than keeping resources I'd never even earned myself sitting in bank accounts. She'd seen how lonely I'd been since Robert died, she said, and she'd hoped this wedding would bring us all closer together. Instead, my selfishness was driving the family apart. When Jessica finished her performance, I hung up the phone without saying another word. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by the silence of my supposedly pathetic life, and I made more phone calls. I called the locksmith Patricia had recommended and scheduled them to come Wednesday morning. I called my bank and put alerts on all my accounts. I called Mary and asked her to stay at my house Wednesday evening because I had a feeling Daniel and Jessica might decide to visit. Wednesday morning, the locksmith arrived at 9 o'clock sharp. His name was Tom Rodriguez, and he'd been changing locks for families in crisis for 15 years. He'd seen financial abuse, domestic manipulation, adult children who'd become threats to their own parents. He changed my locks efficiently and professionally, installed deadbolts and security chains, and gave me advice about home security systems that I took very seriously. While Tom worked, I packed up everything in my house that belonged to Daniel. Photo albums from his childhood, trophies from high school sports, books and clothes and memorabilia he'd left behind over the years. I boxed it all carefully and neatly, labeled each box clearly, and stacked them by the front door. If he wanted his belongings, he could have them, but he wouldn't be getting them by walking into my house whenever he felt like it. That afternoon, I met with Sarah Chen at the investment firm downtown. Sarah had been managing money for Robert and me for 8 years, and she understood both our financial goals and our family dynamics. When I explained what had been happening with Daniel and the wedding demands, she wasn't surprised. She'd seen similar situations before, she said, where adult children developed unrealistic expectations about their parents' resources. Sarah helped me understand something important about financial boundaries and family relationships. She explained that people who are manipulative about money will escalate their demands when their initial strategies don't work. Daniel's wedding request had been a test, she said, to see how much he could extract from me and how effectively he could manipulate my emotions. My refusal wouldn't end his efforts, it would intensify them. We restructured my investment portfolio to make it completely independent and secure. Sarah set up new accounts that only I could access, moved assets into structures that couldn't be claimed or attached by anyone else, and created clear documentation of my financial independence. She also connected me with a financial counselor who specialized in family manipulation, someone who could help me maintain healthy boundaries as Daniel's behavior inevitably escalated. Wednesday evening, Mary arrived at my house with takeout Chinese food and a bottle of wine. She'd been my closest confidant since childhood, had supported me through Robert's illness and death, and had watched Daniel's transformation from caring son to entitled manipulator. She wasn't surprised by his behavior around the wedding, she said, because she'd been watching him take advantage of my generosity for months. "You know what bothers me most about this whole situation?" Mary asked as we ate dinner in my newly secured house. "It's not that Daniel wants money for his wedding. Lots of families help with wedding expenses. It's that he's decided you owe him that money and he's willing to destroy your relationship to get it. That's not love, Margaret. That's exploitation." Mary had been watching Daniel's behavior more objectively than I had, she said, because she didn't have the emotional investment of a mother. She'd seen him manipulate me after Robert's funeral, using my grief to establish financial dependency. She'd watched him bring Jessica around to assess my resources and plan strategies for accessing them. She'd observed the way they talked about me when they thought no one was listening, like I was a resource to be managed rather than a person to be respected. "He's been setting you up for this moment for 3 years," Mary said. "Every time you've helped him financially, he's been training you to believe that's what love looks like. Every time you've said yes to his requests, he's been conditioning you to feel guilty about your own security. This wedding isn't really about getting married, it's about establishing that your money belongs to him." At 9:30 that evening, Daniel and Jessica arrived at my house. I watched through the front window as Daniel tried his key in the lock, saw his confusion when it didn't work, watched him try the back door and the side entrance. They rang the doorbell persistently, knocked loudly, called my name through the windows. Jessica tried calling my cell phone while standing on my front porch, letting it ring and ring while staring directly at the house. When I didn't answer the door or the phone, Daniel's behavior became more aggressive. He pounded on the windows, shouted that he knew I was inside, demanded that I open the door and talk to him like an adult. He said I was being childish and manipulative, that changing the locks was a vindictive and cruel response to a simple disagreement about money. He said normal families worked through their problems by communicating, not by shutting each other out like petty teenagers. Jessica took a different approach. She called through the window that they just wanted to talk, that they were willing to compromise on the wedding expenses, that family was more important than any argument about money. She said she loved me and wanted me to be part of their wedding day, that they needed my wisdom and guidance to plan a celebration that would honor Robert's memory and bring the family together. But their words revealed the depth of their miscalculation. They still thought this was a negotiation about money, still believed they could find the right combination of pressure and manipulation to get what they wanted. They didn't understand that my refusal to fund their wedding was actually a decision to protect myself from further exploitation. They thought changing my locks was a tantrum, when it was actually a boundary. After an hour of increasingly desperate attempts to get into my house, they finally left. Mary and I watched from the upstairs window as they stood in my driveway arguing with each other. Daniel's body language was angry and frustrated, his hands gesturing wildly as he spoke. Jessica's posture was calculating and strategic, like she was already working on alternative approaches to the same goal. Thursday morning brought a new escalation in their campaign. Daniel called my house repeatedly, leaving voicemails that ranged from accusatory to pleading to threatening. He said I was tearing the family apart over money, making their engagement period miserable when it should have been the happiest time of their lives. He said Jessica's parents were asking questions about why my own son's mother wasn't supporting their wedding, and he didn't know what to tell them. But the most revealing voicemail came Thursday afternoon. Daniel's voice was cold and calculated, and his message was brief and clear. "You have until Friday evening to reconsider your position on the wedding funding. After that, Jessica and I will have to make some difficult decisions about our relationship with you going forward. I hope you understand what's at stake here." It was an ultimatum disguised as a deadline, a threat wrapped in concern for our relationship. He was giving me one last chance to submit to his financial demands before he implemented whatever consequences he'd decided would bring me back in line. The message revealed something important about how he viewed our relationship. As a transaction where my financial support bought me access to his presence in my life. Friday morning, I called Father Williams at our church and asked if I could speak with him privately. Father Williams had known our family since Daniel was in elementary school, had baptized Daniel, confirmed him, and had officiated at Robert's funeral. He understood our family dynamics and had watched Daniel grow from a sweet child into the entitled adult he'd become. When I explained the situation with the wedding demands and Daniel's threats, Father Williams wasn't surprised. He'd seen similar situations in other families, he said, where grief and financial resources created opportunities for manipulation. He'd watched adult children exploit their parents' love and generosity, using emotional blackmail to extract resources they hadn't earned and didn't deserve. "Margaret," Father Williams said, "love doesn't demand payment. Real love doesn't threaten to withdraw itself when it doesn't get what it wants. What Daniel is offering you isn't love, it's a business arrangement where your financial support purchases his continued presence in your life. That's not how families are supposed to work. Father Williams helped me understand something crucial about the situation. Daniel's ultimatum wasn't really about the wedding money, it was about power and control. He'd established a pattern where my emotional security depended on my financial generosity, and now he was testing whether that control was strong enough to override my better judgment. The wedding was just the vehicle for a much larger question about who controlled my life and my resources. We talked about the difference between helping someone and enabling someone, between supporting family and being exploited by family. Father Williams reminded me that Robert had always taught Daniel to be self-reliant and responsible, that Robert would never have approved of his son manipulating his widow for money. The values Robert had tried to instill in Daniel were the same values that should guide my response to this situation. Friday afternoon, I made my final preparations for what I knew would be Daniel's last attempt to get the wedding money. I called Patricia and asked her to be available Friday evening in case I needed support. I made sure my phone was charged and my security system was activated. I reviewed the financial documents James Morrison had prepared, the legal protections Sarah Chen had put in place, and the new account structures that would protect me from future manipulation. Most importantly, I spent time thinking about Robert and what he would have wanted me to do in this situation. Robert had loved Daniel deeply, but he'd also believed in personal responsibility and treating others with respect. Robert had worked hard to provide for his family, but he'd never believed that his resources existed primarily to fund other people's lifestyle choices. Robert had been generous with those he loved, but he'd also maintained clear boundaries about his own dignity and financial security. At 6 o'clock Friday evening, Daniel and Jessica arrived at my house right on schedule. This time, they didn't try to use Daniel's old key or attempt to get inside without permission. Instead, they rang the doorbell and waited politely for me to answer. When I opened the door, keeping the security chain engaged, Daniel's demeanor was different than I'd ever seen before. He was calm, controlled, and coldly determined. "Mom," he said, "we need to settle this wedding situation tonight. Jessica and I have been patient with you. We've tried to understand your concerns about the money, but we can't wait any longer. The vendors need payments, the venue needs confirmation, and our guests need to know whether they should plan to attend our wedding or not." Jessica stood slightly behind Daniel, her expression carefully neutral but her eyes calculating. She was letting Daniel take the lead in this final negotiation, but I could see her coaching him with subtle gestures and meaningful looks. They'd planned this conversation as carefully as they'd planned their wedding budget presentation. "We're prepared to make one final offer," Daniel continued. "We'll reduce the wedding budget to $65,000. That's a significant compromise on our part, giving up some of the elements that were most important to us. But we're willing to make that sacrifice to keep the family together. All you have to do is say yes, and we can move forward with planning a beautiful wedding that will make everyone happy." It was their final negotiation tactic, presenting a reduced demand as if it were a generous concession on their part. $65,000 was still an enormous amount of money, still more than many people spent on cars or college tuition or down payments on houses. But they were framing it as a compromise, as evidence of their flexibility and their commitment to working things out with family. When I didn't respond immediately, Jessica stepped forward and took over the conversation. Her approach was softer than Daniel's, more emotional and personal. She said she'd been thinking about our relationship, about how much she'd looked forward to having me as a mother-in-law, about how important family connections were to her. "I lost my grandmother last year," Jessica said, "and one of my biggest regrets is that we never got to plan my wedding together. She always talked about how much she wanted to help with my wedding, how proud she'd be to see me married. When she died, I thought I'd lost that opportunity forever. But then I met Daniel, and I got excited about having you as part of my wedding planning. I thought we'd have that special mother and daughter relationship that I'd missed with my grandmother." It was emotional manipulation dressed up as vulnerability, using her genuine loss to pressure me into funding her expensive party. She was comparing herself to a grieving granddaughter and casting me in the role of the generous grandmother who should honor that relationship through financial sacrifice. The manipulation was sophisticated and calculated, designed to make me feel like refusing would be a betrayal of something sacred. "But now," Jessica continued, "I feel like you're rejecting me before you even get to know me. You're letting money come between us before we've had a chance to build a real relationship. I don't understand why you'd choose financial security over family connection, why you'd risk losing your son and future daughter-in-law over something as temporary as money." Daniel nodded along with Jessica's performance, adding his own emotional weight to her words. He said he'd been thinking about Robert, about what kind of man his father had been, about what Robert would have wanted for his son's wedding day. Robert had always put family first, Daniel said, always made sacrifices to ensure his loved ones were happy and secure. Robert would have been excited about the wedding, proud to contribute to such an important milestone. Dad would be disappointed in what you've become since he died, Daniel said, his voice heavy with artificial sadness. He'd be heartbroken to see you hoarding money instead of using it to celebrate family. He'd wonder what happened to the generous, loving woman he married, the woman who always put her family's happiness ahead of her own comfort. It was the cruelest manipulation yet, using Robert's memory and my grief as weapons against me. Daniel was suggesting that refusing to fund his wedding meant I'd betrayed Robert's values and transformed into someone Robert wouldn't recognize or approve of. He was making my dead husband complicit in his financial exploitation, claiming that Robert's spirit supported Daniel's demands. But what Daniel didn't understand was that invoking Robert's memory had the opposite effect from what he intended. Robert's values were exactly why I couldn't give them the money. Robert had believed in earning what you received, treating people with respect, and maintaining your dignity in all circumstances. Robert had been generous, but he'd also been wise about the difference between helping someone and enabling their bad behavior. I looked at my son and his fiancée standing on my front porch, making their final demand for my money while threatening to cut me out of their lives if I didn't comply. I thought about the 3 years since Robert's death, about all the ways Daniel had manipulated my grief and loneliness to establish financial control over me. I thought about the wedding planning folder, the public humiliation at the restaurant, the emotional blackmail and social pressure, and threats about my future care. And then I did something that surprised all of us, including myself. I started laughing. It wasn't bitter laughter or angry laughter or hysterical laughter. It was the laughter of recognition, of finally seeing a situation clearly after months of confusion and self-doubt. It was the laughter of someone who just realized that the power in this relationship had never belonged to the people making the demands. Daniel's reaction was immediate and revealing. His face flushed red, his jaw tightened, and his voice rose to a volume that my neighbors could certainly hear. "What the hell is so funny, Mom? We're trying to have a serious conversation about family and you're laughing like some kind of crazy person. This is exactly the kind of behavior that makes us worried about your mental state." The accusation about my mental state was a new tactic, suggesting that my refusal to give them money was evidence of cognitive decline or emotional instability. It was a calculated attempt to undermine my credibility and my right to make decisions about my own resources. If I was mentally unfit, then they had justification for taking control of my finances for my own good. But the accusation backfired completely, because it revealed the depth of their desperation and the emptiness of their position. They'd run out of legitimate arguments and were now resorting to questioning my sanity as a way to dismiss my autonomy. It was the kind of tactic that adult children used when they wanted to justify taking control of elderly parents, and it showed exactly how they viewed me and my rights. I stopped laughing and looked directly at Daniel, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since Robert's death. This wasn't my little boy who needed his mother's help to navigate the world. This wasn't even a struggling adult who'd fallen on hard times and needed temporary support. This was a 35-year-old man who decided that my financial resources belonged to him and who was willing to destroy our relationship to get access to them. "Daniel," I said quietly, "I want you and Jessica to leave my property now. I won't be contributing to your wedding expenses, and I won't be tolerating any more threats or manipulation from either of you. If you'd like to have a respectful conversation about our relationship in the future, you can call and ask like an adult, but this conversation is over." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stared at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language, like the words coming out of my mouth made no sense in the context of our relationship. Jessica's carefully controlled expression cracked, revealing the anger and frustration she'd been hiding underneath her performance. "Fine," Daniel said finally, his voice cold and flat. "If that's your final decision, then you need to understand the consequences. Jessica and I won't be able to maintain a relationship with someone who's proven they don't care about our happiness or our future. We won't be bringing our children around someone who's shown herself to be selfish and vindictive. You're choosing money over family, and that choice has consequences." It was his final threat, his last attempt to use my love for him as leverage to get the money. He was telling me that refusing to fund his wedding would cost me access to him, to Jessica, and to any grandchildren they might have. He was weaponizing my maternal instincts and my hopes for the future, making my financial compliance the price of remaining part of my own family. Jessica nodded along with Daniel's words, adding her own twist to the threat. "I'm really sad that it's come to this," she said, her voice dripping with false regret. "I'd hoped we could work this out as a family, but I understand now that your priorities are different from ours." We'll have to move forward without your support, and unfortunately, that means moving forward without your involvement in our lives. They were presenting their abandonment of me as a natural consequence of my selfishness, as if they were reluctantly being forced to cut ties with someone who'd proven herself unworthy of family membership. It was manipulation disguised as sadness, emotional blackmail wrapped in disappointment. But what they didn't understand was that their threats had just freed me from any remaining obligation to consider their feelings or protect their comfort. They'd made it clear that our relationship was transactional, that their love for me was conditional on my financial compliance. Once I understood that, the decision became simple. "I understand," I said calmly. "You've made your position very clear. You're telling me that my value to you is purely financial, and that refusing to give you money means I'm no longer welcome in your lives. I appreciate your honesty about what our relationship means to you." Daniel started to protest that I was misunderstanding their position, that they weren't making our relationship about money, that they were just disappointed in my lack of support for their happiness. But his protests rang hollow after the threats he'd just made, after the ultimatum he'd delivered after 3 years of escalating financial demands. "Daniel," I said, "you and Jessica need to leave now. You've said what you came to say, you've made your position clear, and you've heard my response. There's nothing left to discuss." They stood on my porch for another few minutes, apparently waiting for me to change my mind or break down or beg them not to cut me out of their lives. When none of that happened, when I simply stood there calmly waiting for them to leave, they finally walked back to their car. I watched them drive away, saw Daniel's angry gestures as he spoke to Jessica, saw Jessica's calculating expression as she planned their next move. Then I closed and locked my door, turned on my security system, and called Mary to tell her what had happened. Mary wasn't surprised by Daniel's threats or Jessica's manipulation, but she was proud of me for finally setting clear boundaries and refusing to be intimidated. "You know what's going to happen next, don't you?" Mary asked. "They're going to wait a few days for you to panic about losing them, and then they're going to call with a reduced offer, maybe 30,000, maybe 40,000. They'll present it as a generous compromise, a sign of their willingness to work with you despite your unreasonable behavior." Mary was right, of course. The following week brought a series of increasingly desperate attempts to reopen negotiations. Daniel called twice, leaving voicemails that alternated between anger and hurt feelings. Jessica sent flowers with a card about how much she valued our relationship and hoped we could work things out. Jessica's mother called to express concern about family divisions and suggest that everyone should be more flexible for the sake of harmony. But the most revealing contact came 10 days after their final visit. Daniel called from a blocked number, probably hoping I'd answer without recognizing his caller ID. When I picked up, his tone was completely different from the cold threats he'd made on my porch. He sounded worried and uncertain, like someone who was beginning to understand that his strategy hadn't worked. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I wonder if there's some middle ground we haven't considered. Jessica and I have been talking, and we're willing to significantly reduce the wedding budget if it would make you more comfortable helping us. We could bring it down to 40,000, maybe even 35,000. We just want you to be part of our special day." It was exactly what Mary had predicted, a reduced demand presented as a compromise. Daniel was testing whether his threats had made me desperate enough to accept a smaller version of the same exploitation. He was offering me the opportunity to buy my way back into his good graces at a discount price. But what Daniel still didn't understand was that the amount of money had never been the real issue. The problem wasn't that 82,000 was too much, but that I'd recognized the manipulation and refused to enable it. Reducing the demand to 35,000 didn't change the fundamental dynamic where my financial compliance purchased access to my own son. "Daniel," I said, "I'm not interested in negotiating about wedding expenses. I've made my position clear, and that position hasn't changed. If you'd like to have a conversation about rebuilding our relationship based on mutual respect rather than financial transactions, I'm open to that discussion. But I'm not going to pay for the privilege of being part of your life." The silence that followed was long and uncomfortable. I could hear Daniel processing what I'd said, trying to understand how his negotiation strategy had failed so completely. When he finally spoke, his voice was confused and frustrated. "I don't understand what's happened to you, Mom. You used to care about family, you used to want to help when people needed support. Now you're acting like helping your own son is some kind of burden or inconvenience. What happened to the woman who always put family first?" It was a revealing question, because it showed how completely Daniel had misunderstood the situation. He thought I'd changed, become selfish or bitter or uncaring. He couldn't see that I'd actually become more clear-eyed about the difference between helping family and being exploited by family. I'd stopped confusing financial manipulation with love, stopped allowing guilt to override my judgment about healthy relationships. "Daniel," I said gently, "I'm the same woman I've always been. I still love you, I still want you to be happy, and I still care deeply about family. But I've learned the difference between supporting someone and enabling someone, between generosity and exploitation. If you'd like to work on having a healthy relationship based on mutual respect, I'm interested in that conversation. But I'm not interested in being treated as a financial resource. After that conversation, the contacts from Daniel and Jessica stopped completely. No more phone calls, no more flowers, no more messages through other family members. It was as if they'd decided that since they couldn't extract money from me, there was no point in maintaining any relationship at all. Their silence was more revealing than their threats had been, because it proved that their interest in me had been purely financial. Mary suggested that they might come back eventually, when they realized that cutting me off hadn't produced the desperate response they'd expected. Some people think that withdrawing their presence is the ultimate punishment, she said. They expect you to panic and beg them to come back on their terms. When that doesn't happen, they sometimes reconsider their strategy. But I wasn't holding my breath waiting for Daniel to recognize the error of his ways. I'd seen too clearly who he'd become, understood too completely how he viewed our relationship, to believe that he was capable of the kind of self-reflection that would lead to genuine change. He'd made his choice when he decided that my money was more important than my dignity, and now he had to live with the consequences of that choice. 3 months later, I heard through the family network that Daniel and Jessica had gotten married after all. They'd had a much smaller ceremony, apparently, paid for by Jessica's parents and some creative financing arrangements. The wedding had taken place at a local country club instead of in Napa Valley, with a DJ instead of a live band and a buffet instead of plated dinners. By all accounts, it had been a perfectly nice wedding, the kind of celebration that most couples would have been happy to have. The fact that they'd been able to have a wedding without my financial contribution proved something important. They'd never actually needed my money. The expensive dream wedding had been a want, not a need, and they'd been perfectly capable of creating a meaningful celebration within their own means. The crisis and urgency and desperation had all been manufactured to pressure me into funding their luxury preferences. I felt a mixture of sadness and vindication when I heard about their wedding. Sadness because I'd missed my only child's wedding day, because the relationship I'd cherished for 35 years had been destroyed over money, because Daniel had chosen financial demands over family connection. But also vindication, because their successful wedding proved that my money had never been necessary, that their threats and manipulation had been based on greed rather than genuine need. 6 months after the wedding, Patricia mentioned that she'd seen Daniel and Jessica at the grocery store. They'd asked about me, she said, wondering how I was doing and whether I'd been asking about them. It was the first indication that they might be reconsidering their decision to cut off all contact, the first sign that they might be missing what they'd lost when they chose money over relationship. But I wasn't ready to resume contact with people who'd proven they viewed me as a financial resource rather than a family member. Too much had been said, too many threats had been made, too many manipulative tactics had been deployed for me to trust that their interest in reconnecting was based on love rather than calculation. A year after the wedding incident, I received a Christmas card from Daniel and Jessica. It was a generic holiday greeting with their names signed at the bottom, no personal message or reference to our estrangement. Inside the card was a photograph from their wedding day, both of them smiling in their wedding attire, looking happy and successful. The card felt like a test, a way of checking whether I'd softened my position or become desperate enough for contact that I'd reach out to them. It was a minimal gesture that required no vulnerability or acknowledgement of their behavior, but that might provoke me into making the first move toward reconciliation on their terms. I showed the card to Mary, who rolled her eyes at what she called classic manipulation tactics. They want to see if you'll call them crying about how much you miss them, she said. They want to know if their absence has made you desperate enough to accept their original terms. It's not about rebuilding a relationship, it's about testing whether their leverage has increased. I sent them a Christmas card in return, equally generic, with a photo of me and Mary at a charity event we'd attended together. I signed it "Best wishes for the new year, Mom," with no additional message or invitation for further contact. If they wanted to rebuild our relationship, they needed to do more than send holiday greetings. They needed to acknowledge what had happened and demonstrate that they understood the difference between love and financial exploitation. 2 years after the wedding ultimatum, I heard that Daniel and Jessica were having financial difficulties. Jessica had lost her marketing job, Daniel's company was downsizing, and they were struggling to make payments on the house and car they'd purchased after their wedding. The expensive lifestyle they'd established was becoming unsustainable without 2 full incomes, and they were having to make some difficult adjustments. Mary suggested that their financial stress might lead to another attempt to reconnect with me, probably framed as concern for my well-being, but actually motivated by hope for financial assistance. People like that don't change their fundamental approach to relationships, she warned. They just wait for new opportunities to implement the same strategies. Sure enough, 3 weeks later, Daniel called me directly for the first time in 2 years. His voice was subdued and careful, and he asked how I'd been feeling, whether I'd been taking care of myself, if I needed any help with house maintenance or financial management. It was a transparent attempt to position himself as a caring son who was worried about his aging mother's welfare. When I assured him that I was doing well and didn't need any assistance, he shifted to indirect requests for information about my financial situation. He asked whether I was still living alone in such a big house, whether I'd considered downsizing to something more manageable, whether I'd thought about what I wanted to do with all my resources as I got older. He was fishing for information about my assets and my estate planning, trying to assess whether I might be vulnerable to new forms of manipulation. I kept my responses brief and noncommittal, giving him no information he could use to develop new strategies for accessing my money. After 15 minutes of careful probing disguised as concern, he finally got to the real point of his call. He and Jessica were going through a challenging time, he said, and he'd been thinking about family and the importance of supporting each other through difficult periods. I know we had some disagreements about the wedding expenses, he said, but that was a long time ago, and I've learned a lot since then about managing money and making responsible choices. I was wondering if we might be able to work through whatever issues came between us and rebuild our relationship as a family. It was a carefully crafted apology that acknowledged no specific wrongdoing and accepted no responsibility for the manipulation and threats that had destroyed our relationship. He was framing our estrangement as disagreements about wedding expenses rather than his systematic financial abuse and emotional blackmail. He was suggesting that time had somehow resolved the fundamental issues without any change in his behavior or perspective. Daniel, I said, I'm always open to having honest conversations about our relationship, but rebuilding trust requires acknowledging what went wrong, not just pretending that time has made the problems disappear. If you'd like to have a real discussion about what happened and how we might move forward, I'm interested in that conversation. But I'm not interested in pretending that nothing happened. The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know about Daniel's readiness for genuine reconciliation. He'd been hoping for a quick reset that would restore his access to my resources without requiring him to confront his behavior or change his approach to our relationship. When I made it clear that rebuilding our relationship would require accountability and growth on his part, he lost interest immediately. I was hoping you'd be ready to move past all that old stuff, he said finally. I thought family was more important than holding grudges about ancient history, but I guess I was wrong about your priorities. It was the same manipulation he'd used 3 years earlier, suggesting that my insistence on boundaries and accountability was evidence of my failure as a family member. He was trying to make me the problem for not accepting his non-apology and returning to the previous dynamic, where his financial demands were disguised as expressions of family love. Daniel, I said, family is extremely important to me. That's exactly why I insist on relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial exploitation. If and when you're ready to have that kind of relationship, I'll be here, but I'm not going back to being treated as a resource to be managed. That conversation was 8 months ago, and I haven't heard from Daniel since. I don't expect to hear from him unless his financial situation becomes desperate enough that he's willing to attempt new forms of manipulation, or unless he experiences genuine personal growth that leads him to understand what he destroyed and why. In the meantime, I've built a life that's full of meaning and connection and purpose. I volunteer at the Literacy Center downtown, teaching adults to read and helping immigrants prepare for citizenship tests. I've joined a hiking group for active seniors, and we explore state parks and nature trails throughout the region. I've taken cooking classes, joined a book club, and started painting watercolors. I've traveled to places Robert and I always wanted to visit, using the resources we'd saved for our retirement dreams. Most importantly, I've deepened my relationships with people who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide financially. Mary and I have grown even closer, supporting each other through the challenges of aging and celebrating the freedoms that come with this stage of life. Patricia and I have become dear friends, sharing daily walks and weekly dinners and frequent conversations about everything from gardening to politics to grandchildren. I've also connected with other women who have experienced similar financial manipulation from adult children. Through Father Williams and the church community, I've met several widows who have had to set boundaries with entitled family members who viewed their resources as inheritance advances. We've formed an informal support group, sharing strategies for maintaining independence and dignity while navigating complex family dynamics. What I've learned through this experience is that real love doesn't make financial demands. Real love doesn't threaten to withdraw itself when it doesn't get what it wants. Real love doesn't manipulate grief and loneliness to extract compliance. Real love respects boundaries, values dignity, and seeks the well-being of the beloved rather than personal advantage. I miss the son I thought I had, the son who seemed to care about my well-being rather than my bank account. But I don't miss the stress of wondering when the next financial demand would come, the guilt of feeling obligated to fund other people's lifestyle choices, the exhaustion of constant emotional manipulation disguised as family love. At 68 years old, I've learned that it's never too late to reclaim your dignity, set healthy boundaries, and refuse to be exploited by people who claim to love you. I've learned that saying no to manipulation is saying yes to yourself, that protecting your resources is protecting your future, and that real family respects your autonomy rather than trying to control it. My house is still too big for one person, according to some people's standards. My investment accounts are still growing, my financial security is still intact, and my independence is still complete. I use my resources to support causes I believe in, to help people who truly need assistance, and to live a life that would make Robert proud. I don't use my money to purchase relationships or enable manipulation or fund other people's unrealistic expectations. If Daniel ever develops the wisdom and humility to understand what he lost when he chose financial exploitation over genuine relationship, I'll be open to rebuilding our connection on healthy terms. But I won't sacrifice my dignity, my security, or my self-respect to maintain access to someone who views me as a financial resource rather than a human being deserving of love and respect. The most important lesson I've learned is that wisdom does strike back, not through revenge or cruelty or vindictive behavior, but through clarity and boundaries and the quiet strength that comes from refusing to be diminished by other people's greed and manipulation. I've learned that protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfish, it's necessary, and I've learned that real family will respect your boundaries rather than punishing you for having them. If Margaret's story resonated with you, you're in the right place. Here at Wisdom Strikes Back,